Hello, this is the review of Assignment 6 on the WPF path.
Our first task was to add a vending machine to our supplied library. So this functions as the intermediate class between the baseline model objects, or the business logic, and the view class, which we're using WPF applications for. So let's take a look at that code, and we see it here, and here's vending machine. First thing we notice is that it is implementing notify property changed. It will be publishing the fact that certain pertinent properties have changed during the course of running the application, and so the view needs to update itself. And I'm just calling this an intermediate class. It's not necessarily a view model, it's not necessarily a controller, it's just code that goes between a model class and the view. Okay, so its contents are a can rack, a coin box, in fact 2 coin boxes, a soda price, some instructions that will be printed out at some point, and then here we have the eject can, which is basically using the objects of class can rack and coin box and purchase price to determine whether or not a can is ejected by the machine. So here we've got a property associated with this class that isn't associated with the other business logic classes. And then we have the code that is included with all publishing classes in these patterns, so that the subscribing classes in the view can be properly updated. And then the constructor is essentially instantiating the necessary classes. So that's the addition to the library. Then let's move on to the next part, which is to create the WPF application that's going to make use of that library along with that intermediate class. So the details of this are in the WinForms part. I won't repeat them here. Essentially what we're trying to do is create what most people think of as a vending machine, or the operations of what most people think of as a vending machine. So let's take a look at that code. Of course, we have a reference to our library, which would include most of the code we've written up until this point, including the new class called vending machine. And let's start with the code behind. And this is where we see the real power of the fact that we used a pattern to minimize the business logic in the GUI, which makes the code cleaner, provides a better separation of concerns, and makes the code a lot easier to test, especially with automated methods. So we start with a field that is the vending machine itself, and we will assign that to our data context. So that's where our bound fields in this WPF application will be getting their values. And for each of the buttons, we somehow manipulate the business logic using the intermediate class vending machine. And you'll note that there is virtually no logic in this application, so there's very little to test, which is nice because it's a lot harder to test GUIs than it is just straight code. So as a person that needs to write test code, this sort of thing should make our hearts sing. All right, let's take a look at the designer. And so we have 3 buttons for ejecting a particular flavor of soda here, and 4 buttons for inserting coins into the machine, and a button for coin return. And then a couple of labels or text boxes, like for example total inserted or exact change required. So let's take a look at the XAML, the XAML file for this. So our main container is a stack panel, and there's my text block, and as you see, it is bound to something called instructions. If you go back and look at the vending machine class, you can see that. And then I've got a grid, and in that grid I put the buttons for ejecting a particular flavor of soda. And notice that I have included an image inside of that button, and that's what allows me to create an image button. And then another stack panel, and we've got our buttons for entering money, and another grid, and we have a couple of text blocks for presenting the user with information. Now we do notice here that we have the exact change required light. Let's take a look at the mechanism for implementing that. Here's a text block, and its text property is bound to main coin box can make change, but of course that's a Boolean value, true or false, so I'm going to process that through a converter called exact change indicator converter. Before we look at that code, let's just take a look at the resource. So up here at the top we have a Windows resource saying that we want to use exact change converter, and that's the name that we're going to use when we call it in our code. And let's just go ahead and take a look at that code itself. It's pretty simple. It implements iValue converter. It has a convert, it has a convert back, but we're not using that, so it's not implemented. And the convert simply takes the value passed and treats it as a bool, as you can see here. And if that's equal to true, then we return string.empty, which is to say we set the value of the text property to nothing. And if it's false, then exact change is required. Because if it's false, it means that can make change is false. And if we can't make change, then exact change is required. So let's just go ahead and run it. And we can click on a particular button, which puts money in the machine. And we see that reflected here in this label. And then we can select a flavor. We get our message. And because we had so little change in the machine, exact change is now required. And we can continually select a particular flavor, and eventually we will run out of that flavor and we will not be able to select it anymore.
And that's the review of assignment 6 on the core WPF path.